All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to our event tonight, which is launching this book you're going to hear all about. And I want to first acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Stolo, Kwantlen, and Katzie nations. We're very grateful for that. Beautiful area we live in with plenty of water. And first I want to call Glen Van Brummelen, who's the dean. I'm the assistant dean, so my job is to introduce the dean. I'm David Clements, assistant dean of the Faculty of Natural and Applied Sciences. And through a generous grant that he's going to talk about, we're able to put on this book launch tonight of this great book.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see everybody here tonight. I'm really excited about this event, a step towards building a community of people interested in issues of faith and science. I joined the Faculty of Natural and Applied Sciences about a year and a half ago. So you can guess what happened a year and a half ago. I don't know Trinity Western if it wasn't for COVID. This has been my story here. It's been quite an adventure, but at the same time, I've really gotten to know the people when they have been pushed to their extremes. And it has been one of the more rewarding experiences of my life to get to know the 30 or so people who work in the Faculty of Natural and Applied Sciences. Almost all of them work in the Newfield building, except for David. And there are two major characteristics that I've really noticed about these people. One is their resilience. Now, we have heard the word resilience so much over the last little while, we're probably getting tired of it. But there's a special kind of resilience that's required to do the practice of science. Guess what? When you do an experiment, it doesn't work. It doesn't work the second time, nor does it work the 10th or the 20th time. In order to find out something new about the glories of God's creation, you have to be willing to work and never, ever give up. And that comes to the second point that I've come to know about these remarkable people, and that is their passion for the science. I have worked at 4 different colleges, all of which I thought were very passionate people. I didn't know the word passion until I came here. These people are obsessed. They live and breathe, finding out more and more about the beauty and the joy of how God created our world. It's a real honor to come to work with them every day. Now, it makes it no surprise to me that Trinity Western University was the only institution in Canada to be awarded the Supporting Structures Grant. This is a grant of about $230,000 that the Faculty of Natural and Applied Sciences was awarded for the next 3 years. It's the money that's paying for this event. No, we are not spending all $230,000 tonight. But this grant was generously organized by the organization Science and Christianity in Oxford, which has done a lot to support faith and science issues with Canadian and American university schools. It's been funded by 2 different organizations, the Templeton Foundation, as well as the Murdoch Charitable Trust, and we give our thanks to them tonight for that incredible support. That support is going to help 3 of our faculty members get a huge boost to their research, Shane Durbach, Laurie Onyango, and Richard Chandra. But it is also there to promote issues and events on faith and science, and this is the first of those events. So please keep an eye on whatever social media stream you had to find out about this event. This is just the first of many over the next 3 years, including a play that is going to be brought to campus on the life of Michael Faraday. This is the first event. I'd like to welcome everyone here. I'm hoping to make lots of new friends tonight, and hopefully we'll see you at future events. And now I'll turn it over to Arnold.
Thank you, Glenn. So my name is Arnold Sikkema, and I'm here because I'm the executive director of the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, as well as being a professor of physics here at Trinity Western. I'm also the Vancouver contact for a Vancouver chapter, which holds events here at Trinity Western, as well as at Regent College and SFU and BCIT and other places and churches in the area. So I just want to say that the CSCA is happy to co-sponsor this event, like we do with a lot of institutions across Canada. The CSCA is a Canadian organization of scientists who are Christians. And the idea is that we have local chapters and we have faculty members and researchers and people working in industry who are experts in their field, as well as passionate about their Christian faith and are wanting to share and network with you, with students and with colleagues. And so especially I want to invite students to join the CSCA as an organization because it's a free membership opportunity for you as a student. And if you go off elsewhere, you're not going to always have the same supporting Christian faculty around you. But so if you move over to, say, Calgary, who are you going to connect with over there? The members of CSCA in Calgary. And so you'll need to know who they are, and being a member is the best way to get connected that way. So if you want to learn more about the CSCA, there are pamphlets, a lot of pamphlets up outside the door there on the table, so you can pick some up, including a pamphlet that is written by Dennis, and one written by me, and others written by various other people in our networks of people in science and Christianity. So thanks for letting us be part of this event as well. I think we actually kind of helped organize it. So that's great to partner together with institutions like Trinity. And so I'll turn it back to Glenn to introduce Dennis.
Yes, I'm back. All right. It's a real honor to introduce the guest of honor today, Professor Dennis Venema. He received his PhD in 2003 from the University of British Columbia, and his research is on Drosophila melanogaster. Did I pronounce that correctly? Not even close. Okay, I'm a mathematician. What can I say? It's a fancy word for fruit flies. So if you want to support Dennis's research, please feel free to give him your old bananas after the lecture. Fruit flies are a model organism for all sorts of things. In Dennis's case, he works on the genetics of pattern formation and signaling, using fruit flies as an example, but also generalizing to other organisms. Since then, he has spread his wings, so to speak, not fruit flies' wings, but his own wings in recent years, working on all sorts of issues on the interaction between faith, science, and philosophy. In 2017, he was the co-author of the book Adam and the Genome, Reading Scripture After Genetic Science with Scott McKnight. He's a fellow of biology for the BioLogos Foundation, and he's written over 50 articles for them. I actually read about 4 or 5 of them today. I really enjoyed those, so I highly recommend them. The book we celebrate today, as you can see, or you could see on the screen, Biology, Religion, and Philosophy, an Introduction, co-authored with Michael Peterson. It covers much more than the traditional topics here, things like evolution, but it also talks about things like predation and death with connection with the problem of evil, the question of what it means to be uniquely human, love and altruism, and all sorts of other concepts, issues that arise in the study of biology and faith. I was one of the first people to buy this book, and I'm going to admit right now that I often buy books written by my faculty as a sign of my support for their work, not actually intending necessarily to read it. But this one I started reading, and I haven't been able to stop. It's truly a wonderful book. It covers topics with a clarity of writing and a compelling narrative that at this level, it's very rare to see. So I'm very, very much looking forward to tonight. And so I'd like to welcome then one of my new friends in FNAS, Professor Dennis Venema.
Thanks, Glenn. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a delight to be here tonight, and thank you for those of you who have come out in person, and also welcome to those that are joining online. Evangelicals and science skepticism, can philosophy help? Well, there's at least one philosopher in the room and another that will join us by video. So here's hoping they can help. Myron, it's all on your shoulders, man. It's all good. So how does a biologist get involved in a book on philosophy? I was approached by Michael. Michael visited here a number of years ago, and he actually has an honorary doctorate from Trinity Western. He came and at that time I met him. I was working for BioLogos at that time and writing maybe some of those articles that Glen was talking about. And Michael and I got to talking and hit it off. And later on, when Michael had proposed this book to Cambridge, the reviews came back and they said, oh, you should, this is an excellent idea, but you really should have a biologist on board. So it was then that Michael reached out to me and I was privileged to join with him to co-author this book. Certainly a book that I could not even hope to approach on my own because, as my first slide will show, I am not a philosopher. Although I'll tell you a funny story. I had one of my advisees sitting in my office many, many years ago, and they're squinting and looking above my desk. And of course, it's a PhD, just like anybody else's PhD, and it says Doctor of Philosophy, because that's what a PhD is. And the student is squinting at that, and they said, how come if you have a philosophy degree, they let you teach biology? So, not a philosopher, but very much privileged to work with a philosopher and also to have colleagues here, like Myron. One of the great joys of teaching at a liberal arts institution is the blending and interdisciplinary work that you get to do. Not the kind of thing that you could easily do at a straight sort of straight up like non-liberal arts institution. So let me introduce Michael to you briefly. Michael is going to start our evening by joining us with a pre-recorded video, just so you can see my co-author and you can hear his line of thinking and what he thought of for the book. Michael is a professor of philosophy at Asbury in Kentucky and has written a number of books. He's done some really nice work on C.S. Lewis. So if you're interested in C.S. Lewis, and many Christians are, I would highly recommend his book on C.S. Lewis to you. But with that, I will step aside for a moment and Mark will make the technology do its thing and we'll hear from Michael directly.
Greetings to the Trinity Western learning community and to Dennis, my co-author, and Myron, my fellow philosopher. I've spent a lot of my career in science and religion debates in contemporary culture, and I hope I have some helpful words here as you begin your event. Philosophy is an interdisciplinary enterprise, and it can structure productive engagement across disciplines. And when we speak of the relationship of religion and science, I have to say that religion generically is a vague abstraction, and that not all religions are equal in their theological worldview in being able to address the nature of science. And so most of my work is done in relating theism and even distinctively Christian theism to modern science. And this relationship question between science and religion has a history that dates back to the 17th century conflict of the Copernican revolution. Modern science was being born. It could not have arisen in a straight line from ancient and medieval science, which is Aristotelian and dealt with the definitions of how things should behave. But a new way, a new method of studying nature was being born, and that is empirical observation and experiment in order to test theories that we proposed. Science was born in Christian intellectual soil. Copernicus, a faithful priest, Galileo, a faithful layman, Kepler. So as a matter of fact, science came out of a Christian culture. As a matter of philosophy or logic, some of the ideas necessary to science came out of Christian beliefs. The doctrine of creation, for example, tells us that nature is worthwhile and good and intelligibly created. So the underpinnings of science are really there. even a Christian sense of calling to study the created nature that we face is an appropriate calling. And really, in our day, as well as through modernity, the philosophical interpretation of science is what has been the real problem. Early Orthodox Christian understanding of the early pioneers was that science is appropriate. Enlightenment deism, however, began to move God sort of as an engineer outside the universe as we know it, almost to retire him as active in the world. You get the clockwork universe of the Enlightenment. In the 20th century, however, atheism in particular, and just the general dismissal of religion, has wanted to co-opt science for its own purposes. To put a name on it, in our day, philosophical naturalism, the belief that there's no God, no objective morality, that humans are not special in the image of God, that biblical miracles are impossible, all of those kinds of ideas form a package. And in our day, the philosophical naturalists have claimed science as their ally. And the religious community in certain sectors has had no categories to frame a positive relationship between religion and science. So it really is about philosophical interpretation of science, both as a method of inquiry and as a body of knowledge. So I think science is not inherently anti-faith, it's not inherently atheistic or anything else. In fact, I believe it makes best sense in a theistic universe. Indeed, in a Christian theistic universe. Just think about this. Christianity essentially tells us that nature is rational because created by a rational God, that it's good, created as a gift from God. Indeed, that would make it, think about this, sacramental. Physical stuff, material stuff, can be an avenue of grace and of God's working. We pursue humanitarian goals with our scientific knowledge, and that indeed is sacramental. So I think a Christian posture towards science would be positive, that science is very important in God's world, and that we should be confident that there's nothing about real science that puts pressure on Christianity, which gave it birth historically. We might even sense some excitement about science because it can help the believer in seeking greater understanding for his or her faith, as Anselm would say. It can also help the believer give witness to the Christian faith in the world in an intellectual way, something that our culture desperately needs. So the calling of educated Christians, I think in general, is to integrate faith and learning. And faith here includes the intellectual content of our Christian beliefs. And that content can stand up to engagement with science. As St. Thomas said, Christian belief can form a framework, a worldview framework for science. And as Augustine said, we should be willing to be tutored by science in our biblical interpretation. As Aquinas said, all truth is God's truth. And therefore, as Christians, particularly educated Christians, dealing with the world of knowledge and ideas, we cannot afford to surrender any aspect of God's world, God's creation, and the truth about it, as though some other philosophy or religion is more accommodating to that aspect of reality and the truths about that aspect of reality. We can't surrender that. Think about this example. How about biology, which is the study of living organisms? The Gospel of John tells us that God, in the second person of the Trinity, became one with, became bonded with a human being, a biological organism, Jesus of first century Nazareth. In this event, God is implicitly affirming a number of things, it seems to me. The physical order and its goodness, the living world and its goodness, and specifically the human body. And all of these things are studied by the living sciences. Theologically, this makes science sacramental, dealing with the material that our Lord himself took into himself intimately and forever. In helping us understand God's creation, then, science helps us give cups of cold water, so to speak, to seek cures for diseases, to improve human life, and to be God's representatives in those ways in the world. I see this as being a matter of great piety, that as we engage the creation of our Lord, we bless others. So positive intellectual engagement between Christian faith and science is necessary. It's productive. It's not always easy, but the alternative is unacceptable, and the effort is important to the cause of Christ and his kingdom. I hope these thoughts will be helpful in your faith learning community, and I hope that you enjoy and benefit from the event that is unfolding after this video. Best to all.
Okay, here we go. Well, I'm really glad that Michael was able to provide that so that you could have a chance to hear from him directly. His last thoughts actually allude to a second project that we've now begun to undertake, and that will be a second book on biology, evolution, and Christology. What does it mean in light of evolution, what does it mean for Jesus to be fully human? We have a theologian on board for this one too, so, and that's in its proposal stage. So Michael keyed up a few things that I want to take and run with a little bit, just briefly. The idea that science sprouted in Christian soil. And if science is in some way a product of Christian faith or came into its current form in its origins in a Christian setting, how much more should it not be something that we in the present day as Christians embrace and continue to nurture? Also, the idea that God has given us two books. This is kind of just a common way of thinking about science and faith that I find helpful, and is obviously not unique to me, but it's something that I have found helpful, that God has given us both special revelation and general revelation, and that we can know some things from both. Then we'll talk briefly about science as a way of knowing, and then those first little bits will be somewhat brief because I'm a biologist after all, and I like to talk about science. And then what we'll do is we'll look at a few examples where evolution in particular has bumped up against some views of Christianity in ways that make some people uncomfortable, and then perhaps try to unpack some of these ideas in light of those particular examples. So science sprouted in Christian soil. This comes from Sir Isaac Newton. I like to use Newton as an example because my wife is actually relatively closely related to Newton. You can ask her about that if you like. She jokes that it didn't help her in physics class a whit. But this idea that a Christian understanding of the created order as having rationality behind it and having purpose behind it, that is a motivating factor for studying it, because in that sense, we are reading one of God's books to sort of allude to that idea of God having written two books. So Sir Isaac Newton thinking along those lines. Galileo would also be another good example at this time and place. This is a quote that comes from his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. whereas he's making an argument that Copernicism need not be seen as in conflict with Christian faith. For those of you that know Danny Lamoureux within the CSCA, he often assigns this letter to his students to read, and it's well worth the read. Anyway, at one point in that letter, Galileo says this. He says, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use and by some other means give us knowledge which we can attain by them. He would not require us to deny sense and reason in physical matters which are set before our eyes and minds by direct experience or necessary demonstrations. Now, we don't lose sleep over Copernicism, but we do lose sleep in some ways over other things in the present day. I sometimes remind my students we're only 400 years-ish away from Galileo. Think of what science has accomplished, what we've learned through science in that short 400 years. It is truly a gift from God. This is in that same vein, but from a much more recent document, the Trinity Western Statement on Creation from 2001, that says a biblical view of creation does not constrain legitimate science, scientific inquiry and research, because we accept two sources of information, biblical revelation and natural revelation. So this idea that God has given us two books. Okay, so the idea that God is both the author of special revelation and general revelation. And as a result of that, there can be no conflict between those two forms of revelation. Follows from that. Although we appropriate these by different means. We appropriate them through either exegesis and hermeneutics, and we need the gifts of those in our community that have those skills for that. And that general revelation is appropriated through the scientific method. Now, this may produce apparent conflict, and in fact has been seen over history to have done so in many cases. But the conflict is only apparent if indeed there is no conflict between special revelation and general revelation because they have the same author. So the idea that God has given us two books, but that we appropriate them both by human activities, and that those human activities are not necessarily perfect. Here's a quote from Mark Knoll that I had in the abstract for the talk. Again, reinforcing this idea now from a more modern author that both a fully fledged Christian worldview embraces both understanding through nature, through the scientific method, and also through special revelation. And of course, the special revelation that Mark has in mind, specifically in this quote, is of course that the incarnation, that God became incarnate in Jesus and was the Word. So the idea then, again, similar to what Michael was speaking about before, about God putting his stamp of approval on created things, on material things, and that he has given us revelation in multiple ways, and that they're both to be embraced. So science as a way of knowing, and you'll notice that I say not the only way of knowing. Science is a particular set of tools for specific and particular types of questions. It's very good at answering certain types of questions, and it's absolutely lousy for answering other types of questions. I think the trouble we get into sometimes in our culture is when science is confused with scientism. I think because of the success of science in its certain sphere that it has traction, that sometimes lends an impression to the public at large that perhaps it's the only way of knowing, perhaps it's the only means by gaining knowledge, and that there might be nothing else besides science. Well, how does science work? It starts with observations and questions, forming some sort of hypothesis about the way the world works. What differentiates science from other ways of knowing, of course, is that scientists are rather curious types, and that we like to not only make conjectures about the way the world works, but we use those conjectures to make predictions that we then test. And that test could result in one of two outcomes potentially. Of course, this is a bit of a caricature of how science works, but it's useful for our purposes. We might fail to reject a hypothesis, or we might reject a hypothesis. And of course, that's an important distinction because we are not ever going to be in a position where we can accept a hypothesis. To accept a hypothesis would be somehow to make a claim that no further work would be needed, that the question would be settled. Science is always open to future evidence and always open to reinterpreting what it knows in light of that evidence. If one stays on this loop for a long period of time, if we have an idea, a hypothesis, a conjecture about how the world works, we use it to make predictions, we use those predictions to make a number of tests, and we fail to reject a hypothesis for a number of tests, and it continues, that hypothesis continues to generate predictions, eventually we may arrive at something that's what we would call a theory, a broad explanatory framework that has not yet been falsified through experimentation. Of course, that's quite different from the colloquial usage of the term theory. So the term theory in the scientific sense is quite different from its meaning in colloquial usage. In science, a theory is a broad explanatory framework that has withstood repeated experimentation, continues to produce hypotheses that make testable predictions. Colloquial usage, of course, theory means something closer to guess or conjecture. It's a bit unfortunate that that particular word has almost the opposite meaning in common usage compared to what it does in scientific usage. So to say something is only a theory is in fact quite a compliment from a scientific viewpoint. Theories vary in their importance to a given scientific discipline. I have students in genetics right now. They're learning all about the chromosomal theory of inheritance. Some of my colleagues are teaching medical microbiology right now, so those students are learning all about the microbial germ theory of disease as part of that discipline. Theories don't graduate to become proven, is the basic idea here. They remain theories because what a theory is in science is a broad explanatory framework that we have not yet falsified. So in that sense, there's nothing better than a theory. It doesn't graduate to something else. So if that's what science is, and if it had in some sense, it sprouted in a Christian setting that looked at the world as having a rational creator behind it, then perhaps as Christians started with their interaction with science from a scientific realism perspective, perhaps it's something that we in the present day might be well served by returning to more fully. So what is scientific realism? It's the idea that well-supported scientific theories in that scientific sense are good, and we can talk about what good means. That's why the philosophers are in the room, right? Well, that are good approximations of what is true about the natural world and worthy of trust, again, with appropriate caveats in place. The idea is basically a positive disposition towards science. The idea that science is a God-given gift, at least from a theistic perspective, but the idea that science has the ability to have traction and give us information on certain questions, even if it can't answer all of them, but a positive disposition towards science. And the case that I am trying to make to you, and Michael has made to you previously, is the idea that scientific realism is a philosophical view that's well suited to the Christian worldview, that it sits well with the convictions of Christian theism. Okay, so that's some sort of preliminary ideas. This is an allusion to a famous quote from The End of the Origin of Species that you're probably familiar with, where Darwin, after having written his large book, although interestingly enough, Darwin called that book his abstract. He actually intended to write a much, much larger volume, and this was his ideas only in abstract form. And Victorian science is very, very different than present day science. But at the end of that book, he says there's grandeur in this view of life, that, from this simple beginning, that all of these different forms may have been evolved. So with these ideas that we've considered thus far and that Michael has shared with you in view, what I would like to do is to look just briefly at a couple of examples of where science, specifically with respect to evolution, has bumped up against Christian convictions, or seemingly bumped up against Christian convictions. Because we're in this interesting state where even though science got its start within a Christian worldview, we need historians and we need theologians and biblical scholars to sort of flesh it all out for us, but we're not in that state now. And goodness, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we can see even more so how that has become polarized in many Christian communities. Many Christian communities now do not have that sort of positive disposition towards science. They don't have that sort of scientific realism kind of baseline. But could we? Okay, could we return to that? I mean, some areas of Christianity haven't really departed from that, but many of us have, many of our traditions have. Okay, so just briefly, evolution is a theory in the scientific sense. It's a broad explanatory framework. We're actually just past the 162nd anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. It was in November of 1859. The basic ideas that Darwin put forward, we have not yet falsified them. Yes, we have changed them. We have added to his knowledge base quite substantially. But the basic ideas that he laid out, we have not yet falsified. So evolution remains a theory in the scientific sense. However, evolution strongly supports a few hypotheses that are sometimes thought to be at odds with Christian convictions. So the ones that I'd like to talk about tonight, and these are addressed in more detail, each of them in the book, and also in other places that I've written, but specifically some of them in the book. The first one is one that I'm fairly well known for speaking for, and there's lots of things that you can find online about this particular topic, that humans are the product of an evolutionary process. We do share common ancestors with other forms of life. This is not at all a controversial statement among biologists, not even close. It's actually so uncontroversial that nobody within biology, mainstream biology, loses any sleep over this particular question. Now, they might be interested in certain facets of it and how it actually played out in particulars, but the general idea that humans are the product of evolution is not at all controversial. Another one that we'll talk about, and this is also in the book somewhat, that evolution is a mechanism by which new information arises. That it's a way, you can think of evolution as a way of transferring information from the environment to the genomes of organisms as they interact with that environment. And then perhaps most controversially, and there's a chapter in the book on this, that there are certain features of our biology that were once thought to be unique to humans. Altruism is one that I talk about in the book at some length, but there are others. Tool use would be an example. Interestingly enough, as we've learned more through the study of evolution, things that we used to think were unique to humans have slowly sort of fallen, as it were. Now, these various features that were once thought to be unique to us have their full flower in human biology, and we see those things in human biology to an extent that we don't see in many other organisms. But despite that, everything that we've discovered thus far about human biology seems to have parallels in other species, although perhaps with the one exception of altruism, and there's some discussion to be had there in the book. It's worth a read. Okay, let's briefly talk about this first one, that humans are the product of an evolutionary process. And I'm going to have fear not after each one of these points. And that's just a reminder that maybe if you're not completely sold on the idea of scientific realism yet, that perhaps you might warm to it. But in order to warm to it, it's a disposition towards science that requires setting aside fear. Now, scientists are quite good at that, about being dispassionate about things, but I realize that that's not always the same phenotype for people who aren't scientists. Scientists famously say, there's a famous quote among scientists that they would rather have questions that they haven't answered than answers that can't be questioned. Scientists love to live in that world of exploration and unknown. And I do realize that not everybody has a personality type that naturally goes there, but it's Advent, right? And the most common command in all of Scripture, of course, is don't be afraid. If this is actually of God, then perhaps we don't need to be afraid. If science is something that is a God-given mechanism for exploring his world, then perhaps we don't need to be afraid of what we might find there. Okay, so these are just a few examples quickly shown. This is just going to be an attempt to show you in about 5 minutes why biologists don't any longer question the idea that humans and other species share common ancestors. One of the things that you would immediately know if you came across this as you were walking through a field would be that this is a structure that once had a certain function. It doesn't have that function anymore because there's disrepair to it. Unless you've stumbled onto an elaborate movie set, which I guess is a formal possibility, But if it's not a movie set, then this immediately tells you some things about it, tells you that there's a history there. The genetic equivalent of this is what I'm going to try to explain to you, these things that are called pseudogenes. So pseudogenes, it's a historical name. It literally just means false gene. When they were first discovered by biologists, they were called false genes because they had certain features that very much were gene features, but we could tell that they didn't have the same function. They were missing things, just sort of like the analogy here with this building. The interesting thing is that the enzymes that do DNA copying don't know what they're copying. They don't know the function of what they're copying. They are just blind scribes, as it were. Now, they have a very, very good ability to copy things. It's about 99.9999 whatever % accurate, but they do make errors. And when they make errors, they don't understand that they've made an error. And a scribe later on in the tradition isn't going to be able to fix that error because they don't know, they're blind. They just do the best that they can to copy. So what can happen is that you can have genes that lose function due to a mutation. If that doesn't have negative consequences for the organism, then those damaged genes will be slavishly copied in subsequent generations, and they will remain in a lineage for a very long period of time, even after they've lost their function. And biologists love these things because they're very, very useful for organizing and discovering the relatedness of species. So for my colleagues in the room that are familiar with the principles of textual criticism, this is basically textual criticism, but with DNA. So we happen to share many of these defective genes in common with other species. And we share them in common with other species, not just that the same genes are mutated between different species, but that the same genes are not only mutated between different species, but they're actually mutated in exactly the same ways. They have exactly the same changes that render them non-functional. So this is just one example. These are olfactory receptor genes, genes involved in the sense of smell. And not only do we have humans lost many of these, other primates have as well. And we have lost them in many cases, not in an individual species, but we've lost, these genes were lost a very, very long time ago. And long before modern day species, such as say humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, speciated and went their separate ways. So when one of these genes is lost a very, very long time ago, and it's only happening in one group of organisms at that point, it actually starts with one individual and then spreads, then those mutations and changes can be then inherited by other species that descend from that original group that had that original mutation take place in it. Very much like textual criticism. So we see some examples where humans and chimpanzees will share many of them. So these three, for example, here, they're identical between humans and chimps. These three are identical between humans, chimps, and gorillas. These these 6 mutations are identical for all 4. We also see some that are unique to a lineage. But the interesting thing is we don't see anything out of place in this particular data set. If you look at a very large data set, you can find, due to chance occurrences, some things that are a little bit out of the pattern. But the overwhelming pattern is this. If we see something, for example, in humans, and we see exactly the same mutation in gorillas, we can predict with great confidence that it will also be present. The alternative hypothesis that we're looking at independent mutation events is vastly less probable. So this is one of the reasons why biologists are quite confident that humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and so on share common ancestors. It's absolutely not controversial. Okay, so evolution seems to be something that's part of our lineage. Seems to be something that produced our biological frame, as it were. One of the things I knew or was taught growing up, because I was raised in a Christian environment, is that I was also taught that evolution was only a degrading type of thing. You could lose information, but it never generated anything new. So organisms had been created by God, but then were sort of running down as they lost their information, but there was no mechanism by which they could generate new information. That is incorrect. As it turns out, my Christian school elementary experience didn't cut it on that particular point. And the actual truth of it is much more interesting. Evolution is actually quite capable of generating quite a bit of information, more than what is adequate for the task of the biodiversity that we see in front of us. This is one particular line of evidence for that hopefully will be accessible. Whole genome duplication. So when an organism undergoes replication of its chromosomes, occasionally cell division won't take place properly. And as a result, you'll have a duplicated genome. And then with this failure of cell division, you end up with a state where you have twice as many chromosomes as you should have. If you want some info on this in plants, you should talk to Dr. Clements, because it's quite common in plants. What's not so well known is that it's also quite common in some organisms. It's not common in primates, for example, because the consequences of that are not viable in primates. But in fish and amphibians and other things like that, this is actually relatively common, and we can observe it even in the present day. So what happens when you duplicate a whole genome? Maybe I'll skip ahead just for one slide, just to give you an idea of what goes on. When you duplicate a genome, these little boxes are just representing genes, and the line is a chromosome. And it's the idea of, okay, here's the starting state, and then here's after one of these duplication events may have taken place. So if this isn't a lineage over time, what can happen after you have a duplication event, if that persists in a lineage, is it's possible that you will have various losses after the fact. That after the duplication event, you've got 2 copies of everything, and you may not need 2 copies of everything. So it's likely that some of those things will be lost over time. Now, that general principle is proposed to have happened twice over in the lineage leading to all modern vertebrates. There was quite a bit of evidence for this back in the day before we did whole genome sequencing events. But there was this hypothesis in this lineage of vertebrates leading to species like ours, tetrapods, for example, 4-limbed organisms, and also fish, that there were perhaps 2 rounds of whole genome duplication. This was just based on evidence that we saw comparing different genes in different species. But we lacked the ability to really test this hypothesis until we had the ability to do whole genome sequencing and look at whole genomes as opposed to just little bits of genomes here and there. Now, this slide is going to be a bit complicated to understand, but what it's basically doing is testing this hypothesis. It's saying, what pattern would we expect if we look in present day genomes now to see if those organisms have in their evolutionary past these multiple rounds of genome duplication. And if it happened twice, it's the idea that, okay, you've got a duplication and then there would be loss after that duplication. And then at some point, if there's a second duplication, whatever the state was at that point would be duplicated. You would have 2 perfect copies at that point, and then there would be subsequent loss. So the idea is that if this is actually something that has happened to species over time, that the idea is that what we would see in present day species, these now all being sort of 4 separate chromosomes that go back to, they're all modified versions of an original chromosome set in some way, even though this loss has taken place. The idea is that enough of the pattern would persist because some things are retained. The idea is that the overall spatial pattern of duplicates would conform to these large blocks that could be traced back to these ancestral chromosomes. Okay, so what this work is, this is a paper that came out 8 or 9 years ago or so, and it was quite revolutionary at the time. So what this research was basically trying to do was to test this hypothesis. If this actually is a pattern that we see in present day organisms, there might be enough spatial information that we can see that within one organism's genome in the present day, there might be these traces of 4 copies of an ancestral genome with enough of the spatial information left for us to discern it. Now, it just so happens that the human genome is the very best studied vertebrate tetrapod genome. We've done more work on this genome than any other genome. So the natural organism of choice for this particular experiment was to look at the human genome. And what this diagram is showing you is where, when we have a state where there are 4 copies of something, so we look at gene sequences in the human genome and we notice, this gene has 3 other copies that are very similar to it. They're not identical, but they're very similar. Where are those 4 copies spatially in the genome? And when you do that, what you see is that those 4 copies in the genome come in sets of 4. The spatial pattern that's there in the human genome, these are 4 different human chromosomes. So chromosome 17 to 10 and 12, as an example. And the lines are simply drawing where these 4 copies are. So this data set is restricted to looking at ones that have 4 copies. And what you see is like, okay, if you look at these green lines, for example, we see all this spatial information for all of these genes in a particular sequence that are also in a particular sequence on a different chromosome. So the different copies are spatially organized, likewise for these other ones as well. So this is seen as very strong evidence for this particular event. So that the human genome has within it, and actually all vertebrates have within it, not just one ancestral chromosome set, as it were, but actually have 4 chromosome sets within it. So those of you that are students in 371 in genetics, you actually know what that's all about. But now you're looking at the long evolutionary process that has taken those duplications, whole genome duplications, and then modified them. Okay, and here's the interesting thing. These genes don't do all the same things. These genes have new functions, have different functions. They're not 4 duplicates of each other. Evolution has modified their functions slightly to give them different things that they're doing. So thereby increasing the amount of information. Great way to actually build or to add new information. Start with duplicates of everything and then start tweaking those duplicates. Okay, another brief example. So don't be afraid, but features of our biology that were once thought to be unique to humans may or appear to be extensions of features found in other animals. So here's one example that I like to show in my evolutionary biology class. Tool use used to be something that was thought to be a human-specific trait. Crows use tools. They can learn how to use tools, they make tools, and they can teach their young how to use tools. Dolphins use tools, a few chimpanzees use tools. Crows are crazy in their tool use. It's not every crow, it's a specific group of crows in a specific spot, but they know how to use tools. I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about altruism in humans and in non-human primates. The idea is that the idea of reciprocity, of pro-social behavior, of offering help and then perhaps expecting help in return, evolution has fairly good answers for how those sorts of features might be built into a lineage. Humans are interesting, though, because we seem to take that and go with it to places that other organisms don't. As far as we can tell from an evolutionary perspective, all other species that do these sort of reciprocal behaviors are doing it for a net evolutionary benefit, as far as we can tell. And humans are the one example that don't fit that mold. Humans will adopt and care for children that are not their biological children, for example. We don't see that in other species, but we do see it in humans. It's an open area of inquiry. One of the hypotheses is that humans were our lineage was brought this way because of the nature of how we evolved. And then we've sort of taken this to an inappropriate degree. That's sort of one biological interpretation of the evidence. Of course, other theistic interpretations are possible. But if that's of interest to you, that's in the book as well. So one Christian approach to evolution that I would argue for is that it's a powerful mechanism that's intended and designed by God and one that he used to develop biodiversity on Earth. Of course, this goes beyond what the science can tell us. But similarly, Christians are pretty comfortable with these sorts of ideas applied to other areas. In all the years that I've taught Mendelian inheritance, I've never had a student wonder what the problem, or voice any concerns about the randomness that they learn about, for example, with allele segregation. In teaching developmental biology, students are generally fine to think about this wonderful mechanism that they're learning about and that how God used this mechanism to bring them into being and such. So we're comfortable with these ideas, but perhaps we haven't thought about them in terms of evolution before. Perhaps that's new territory. Okay. I would argue that a truly Christian approach has to take scripture and science seriously. We can't ignore either. We can't be uncritical about either. We have to do our homework, as it were. But it's based on this conviction that both of them, science and scripture, are a source of God's revelation. Of course, this requires humility. We have to recognize that both sides of this equation, both the scientific method and exegesis and hermeneutics, are fallible. But I would argue in cases where the scientific evidence remains strong, despite centuries or decades or centuries of examination, Christians have warrant to re-examine their interpretation of special revelation because general revelation is also of God. And we could read Galileo's letter to the Duchess Christina, and it would be remarkably appropriate. I see the role of a believing scientist in this process is to serve the church with the best scientific information possible. So I also strongly believe that this is a missional issue for the church, specifically on origins, because that's the thing I talk about a lot, but more generally for science in general. I strongly feel that an appropriate return to Christian theistically grounded scientific realism is something that we desperately need in the church. Not having that, it's a stumbling block to those outside the faith, it's a barrier for those outside the faith, and it's a stumbling block for those within. So a return to scientific realism might help. An understanding of our history may help. The work of theologians, biblical scholars, and pastors may help. Of course, this is scientific talk, right? Probably will, hopefully, right? And should. And of course, humility and willingness to dialogue will help. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll invite Myron to give his response. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Dennis, and thanks everyone for coming. And I appreciate this opportunity to engage some of the themes that were presented in the book. Man, I love me some Dennis Venema. Let me just say that I've just grown to appreciate Dennis's ability to teach in a way that is edifying for a variety of different audiences. He's just a very skilled teacher of biology. You students who are in his classes are fortunate to be able to have him, and we're fortunate as an academic community here to benefit from the way in which he's able to break down scientific concepts and to teach in ways that just inform our understanding. And he's a beautiful writer too. Like the BioLogos stuff that he's put out is just really accessible. It's very pedagogically useful for a variety of contexts. So thanks, Dennis. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with just a few comments about the Peterson Venema book, and then I'm going to make a few comments just about knowledge claims, talk a little bit about COVID, because why not, and science denial. And that is going to connect hopefully to some themes that we can talk about that are addressed in the book, but also that we can talk about in the Q&A. All right, so some comments just about the book. Let me start with some praise. As was mentioned earlier, and Glen's kind of summary of the different topics that are addressed in it, it is really a great book. It is interesting, it is accessible, it is substantive. It falls into two general parts. The chapters are organized with part one just being a variety of general issues at the intersection of biology, philosophy, and religion. And the second part focuses more specifically on religion and human biology. I do think actually in many respects that part two is the stronger half of the book, and that just might be a function of the fact that it's more connected to topics that I'm personally interested in. But I do think that what we get, especially in the second half of the book, is just a very precise and extensive survey of science, teasing out some of the philosophical implications connected to religion and human biology. So I think that the challenge for this type of book, though, is that it has to navigate so many different areas, multiple disciplinary intersections. It has to connect with science and philosophy. It has to connect science and religion. It has to connect philosophy and religion. To some degree, also, it has to connect the disciplines of biology with chemistry and physics, or biology with psychology, sociology, and anthropology, right? And so the connection between these human behavioral sciences and some of the biological underpinnings. And also, to some degree, it has to connect philosophy of religion with Christianity and with theology. So that's a big task. That's a tall order to be able to do that in a way that is going to be accurate and not do violence to any of these disciplines, and also really tease out some of the really interesting philosophical and theological implications there. And I think that they do that admirably well. I'm very impressed with the breadth of the book and the way that it is able to survey all of these different territories and to present information in a way that is useful and edifying. I think that anyone with any interest in any of these conversations will benefit from reading this book. I do have a wish list, however, for the second edition. I wish that in the second edition, there would be a range of topics that could be addressed in applied ethics, right? That area of philosophy where we look at applications of kind of ethical theories to concrete situations in the ground. And I think that biology and religion is extremely fruitful for this discussion. So maybe there could be a chapter or two in the subsequent edition that has to do perhaps with the science of sex determination in species. For example, kind of looking at the naturalness of biological sex transition in various species, some of the epigenetic and environmental factors that are a part of that. I think that would be a super interesting addition. Also, our capacity to create organoids, right, including mini brains or Neanderthaloids with approximately 2 million neurons. So this is incredibly interesting, where in a glorified Petri dish, you can kind of create a replica brain structure that has about 2 million neuronal connections. And you can do things to those organoids that you can't do to human brains in order to study brain function. And there's lots of really super interesting ethical issues that are raised as a result of that, but also some philosophical and theological ways in which organoids for other organs are used in lab experiments. That would be a super interesting addition. Also, I think some kind of connection to just the practice of biology and biological science and its impact on marginalized groups, perhaps subjects for testing, ecological impacts, some kind of historical survey as well in terms of the ongoing developmental practice of biology. I think that has some interesting ways to intersect with religion and theological claims. Also, I think my own kind of personal wish list for the second edition is that it could maybe perhaps be less Christian. And by that, I mean, more often than not, as I read the book, religion, both in the title and also religion as it's used in the chapters, is really just code for Christianity, right? And not that that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think in some ways, it does reflect just the trend that you see in analytic philosophy of religion over the past 60 years, which is, largely, not exclusively, but disproportionately represented by Christian analytic philosophers, of which I am one, Michael Peterson is one. And the kinds of things that we tend to be interested in have to do with, classical theism and its impact and its intersection both historically with philosophy, but also in contemporary culture. And I think that trend is changing in philosophy of religion as it becomes a little bit more diverse, both with respect to topics and also with respect to participants, but you still kind of get those kind of reflections. So I think, if there's what do I want to say here? There are gestures throughout the book in terms of Islamic and Jewish philosophy, also some Eastern religions as well, but predominantly the religious texts that are referred to are Hebrew Bible and New Testament. And so I think, maybe change the title to Christian religion, biology and philosophy, or expand a little bit of the emphasis there. So those are just things, on my own kind of personal wish list for a subsequent edition. Again, such a really great book. Now, in just the next few minutes, and this is going to hopefully set us up for our discussion time, I want to talk about a 19th century figure, William Clifford, and an essay that he wrote called The Ethics of Belief. I'm going to talk a little bit about knowledge claims and science in pandemic times. I want to talk a little bit about our cognitive kind of processing and COVID conspiracies. And then we're going to circle back to Clifford and then throw it open to Q&A. So Clifford in 1877 wrote this essay called The Ethics of Belief. And what he wanted to point out is that there is a moral dimension to the way that we acquire beliefs, to the way that we maintain beliefs, and to the way that we support our beliefs about the world. And he has this very famous thought experiment involving a ship owner. And the idea is that imagine a ship owner who has this ship that is contracted, or that is under contract to bring a whole wave of immigrants to the New World. And he has pretty strong reasons to think that the ship is actually not seaworthy. It seems to be in disrepair. But he kind of thinks about the status of the ship and this upcoming voyage that it's supposed to take and all these people who are excited to immigrate to the New World. And as Clifford tells this story, the ship owner is able to convince himself that no, actually the ship is seaworthy. And the icing on the cake for the ship owner is that the ship owner reflects that God and God's providence would not let anything happen to the ship. And so finds himself believing that the ship is going to sail, it's going to be okay. And then, of course, it sinks and everyone drowns, and the ship owner collects the insurance and says, who can understand the providence of God, right? So the way that Clifford wants to tell this story, though, is that the ship owner is guilty, morally culpable for the deaths of the people on that ship. But also the ship owner is morally culpable for believing something without sufficient evidence, right? And so this is the moral dimension to regulating the beliefs that we have. We have a duty, an obligation, says Clifford, to follow this principle, which is, to sum up, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, right? So Clifford is a very strong evidentialist. And when I was taught this principle in grad school in philosophy, it was presented, as a strong kind of evidentialist position, but we were encouraged to kind of challenge Clifford by asking, well, what are the criteria for evidence? Does personal experience count as evidence? And Clifford has fairly significant views about wanting to control religion, right? And so there's kind of an underlying theme in Clifford's essay that really is to try and constrain a religious belief and to have religion kind of match up to the standard for evidence. Having said that, as I kind of look around the world in the last, several years, particularly in ways in which science is being responded to through Christian communities in general, and even among evangelicals in particular, I think, wow, we need some more Clifford. We need a healthy dose of Clifford in our lives. In that it's just too easy for people to discount really strong evidence in religious communities in particular. And so what I want to say here is that our cultural and subcultural engagement with science, even during a pandemic, is influenced and constrained by factors that have been shaped by selection pressures over millennia. And how we navigate scientific evidence is downstream from and very often subordinate to how we answer some other more basic questions that have historically been important to us from an evolutionary perspective. So let me spell it out this way. Here are some perennial species level questions. Where is the danger? What should we do? And whom should we trust? And so this whole axis of trying to evaluate situations relative to safety and danger, or relative to certainty and uncertainty, and also relative to in-group and out-group, right? These are historically very important in our development as a species to be able to have answers, ready and quick answers to these type of species level concerns, right? Where's the threat? Am I safe? How do I act? How do I choose to act? Whom can I trust? Are you on my team? Or are you not on my team? And if we're talking maybe in a slightly different talk about religion's role in influencing our development along these lines, religion has some very interesting ways of tuning and amping up these kinds of cognitive processes. All right. Well, when it comes to conspiracy theories, I want to introduce this idea of motivated reasoning, right? And this is something that psychologists will talk about as a whole array of cognitive strategies that we have to support beliefs in the world that conform to our current beliefs, that tend to promote a righteous self-image, where in many contexts we want to be the hero of the narrative, And also, we are kind of motivated to endorse and accept beliefs that enhance social prestige and in-group bonds, right? And if we think back to that previous slide of these different kind of species level concerns, you add kind of a layer of motivated reasoning, which is kind of our cognitive propensity to be inclined to accept beliefs that conform to our current beliefs. It's a lot, less effortful to accept things that just conform to our current beliefs, that promote a righteous self-image, that enhance our space within the group and cement these in-group bonds. We tend to care more about certainty, identity, and status than we do about truth, right? And so there's kind of a cognitive propensity to be able to kind of support beliefs that fit in this kind of realm than it does to whether or not they're true. And so I am with Dennis insofar as I have published on scientific realism. I am a strong proponent of scientific realism as science as our well-confirmed theories in science as a good approximation of true beliefs about nature. And yet we are not, in many contexts, we don't care about truth. We care about other things other than truth because it supports our development as a species in other areas. Well, what are some COVID-19 conspiracies? Hydroxychloroquine is an effective preventative treatment for COVID, but it's suppressed for political and financial reasons. The global threat of COVID-19 was a myth invented to disrupt the credibility of President Trump. The pandemic was started and orchestrated by Bill Gates, who wants to control the global population through vaccination and vaccine management. This is, a good one insofar as, it's inference-rich as a conspiracy theory that QAnon, an elite cabal of democratic, Satan-worshipping, sex-trafficking pedophiles are responsible for the pandemic, and only President Trump can stop them. Actually, this was not invented in the 21st century. It has long antecedents in conspiracy theories throughout history, actually. Like, if you want to demonize an outgroup, you have them, you have to tick a lot of boxes. They have to be sex trafficking pedophiles, they have to be Satan worshiping blood drinkers, and there's a whole kind of list of things that are repeated throughout history. We have these cognitive strategies to support beliefs that conform to our current beliefs, right? If you think Democrats are evil, a theory that says that Democrats are evil, or that scientists hate religion, or this kind of propensity to promote a righteous self-image. I have secret knowledge. I'm a maverick. I fight for true justice. I have empathy for the marginalized, rights of oppressed libertarians, right? Empathy is a very interesting emotion in that it can be used for good and evil as well, right? If you have empathy for people who kind of look like you, that will license all sorts of terrible behavior to people who don't. And so all of this to say is that, like, I think, philosophy is something I've, in addition to, is something, I've given a lot of time to pursue. And I think that we have a lot of work as philosophers that we can do to support science and to support kind of communication of scientific knowledge in ways that are for everybody's good. It's just that a lot of times it's fighting an uphill battle because what we're doing is, trying to help people think in a way that is not going to be easily landing within their own kind of cognitive kind of propensities, especially when it comes to enhancing social prestige and in-group bonds. There's lots of very interesting data, psych data, on how impervious to evidence people are, particularly when it comes to data from climate science. And what different experimental interventions are showing is that really when it comes to like the amount of cognitive dissonance it would require and social cost it would require for someone to move the needle on their own denial of climate science is huge, right? Because it would require essentially, identifying yourself as an outlier among all the people that you are most important to you, right? And so, I mean, philosophy and science can help to some degree, but how to alleviate the pressure for those kinds of psychological bonding that happens, I'm not sure that philosophy can do a whole lot in that respect. So, yeah, I think just a final quotation from Clifford. We all suffer severely enough from the maintenance and support of false beliefs and the fatally wrong actions which they lead to, and the evil born when one such belief is entertained is great and wide. But a greater and wider evil arises when the credulous character is maintained and supported, when a habit of believing for unworthy reasons is fostered and made permanent. If I steal money from any person, there may be no harm done by the mere transfer of possession. You may not feel the loss. But what hurts society, and this is Clifford's really concern, I mean, I think in many respects, Clifford is prophetic here. What hurts society is not that it should lose its property, but that it should become a den of thieves. In like manner, if I let myself believe anything on insufficient evidence, there may be no great harm done by the mere belief, but I cannot help doing this great wrong, that I make myself credulous. The danger to society is not merely that it should believe wrong things, though that is great enough, but that it should become credulous and lose the habit of testing things and inquiring into them, right? And so when it comes to thinking through the relationship of the way in which science is used or appropriated or vilified in different kind of religious communities, and evangelicals don't always, come out shiny here. I think what you have is you've had, just over an extended period of time, the habit of forming a community that's quite credulous. And then when it comes to the rubber hitting the road in terms of how we, need to trust science, it's not surprising that you have this strong kind of resistance, right? So on that happy note, I turn things over to our moderator.
Thank you very much. We are going to have a Q&A here. Okay. Dennis has a question.
Do I get priority? It would seem that science is kind of a curious thing for an evolved a primate like us to be doing in any way, shape, or form anyway. Is it kind of is it some sort of collective resistance to the types of predispositions that you were describing, do you think? Like it's sometimes surprising to me at all that we can kind of pull it off, right? Given our history.
Yeah, I think, so I don't know what your own kind of views are about coevolutionary models for a species and just cultural evolution. Yep. And I think where science is unmatched is its ability to give us a legacy of knowledge that subsequent generations find useful, right? And so I think that, from an evolutionary perspective, ticks a lot of boxes. One thing I would have supplemented Peterson's story about science coming out of Christian soil. I think there is a philosopher named Bob Macaulay, who together with an anthropologist, Tom Lawson, they actually, you get a philosopher and an anthropologist launch a field in cognitive psychological approaches studying religion. But Bob has this great book called Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. And he kind of looks at the 16th century development of science. And in some way, that was the fullness of time insofar as you had a sufficient cultural stability. And I think Christianity played a large part into that, not simply in virtue of its theistic kind of commitments, but just because there was the sufficient kind of social infrastructure to provide a space for scientists to kind of do their work and to share knowledge and information and to kind of have that 400-year period. But it's hard, but it's effortful. Right, and it's hard work, whereas religion is not hard in the same way. So we could lose science, says Macaulay, but religion in some ways will always be with us.
Yeah,
I'm going to be brave and ask one of the first questions from here. I'm not from this community, but I a bit of a gadfly. Michel Myers, a Belgian philosopher, says we jump from a problem to a solution far too quickly. In between the problem, recognizing it, in between the problem and the solution is a problem space. Why are we as humans in so much of a rush to leave the problem space? And he encourages lingering there rather than searching for the apodictic, which is philosophical discourse, but let's linger. What can the science community give us the kind of encouragement to linger in that problem space longer as especially religiously inclined people before jumping to here's the answer?
What do you have any thoughts about how that applies to the practice of science? And I have some.
It's a good question. I think in general, scientists don't tend to be very philosophical in their practice. Scientists are there's diversity in human, just human personalities. And scientists are typically curious, driven people that want to solve problems. So they kind of plow ahead, and perhaps others come in their wake and think about what they're doing, think about why they're doing it, So I think it's part of the sort of the diversity of humanity. This is kind of a subset of humanity, or certain personality types that are kind of driving it, perhaps. I don't know.
I think in some ways too, there's a psychological cost to uncertainty, right? And that it's effortful in ways that are not particularly comfortable. I think depending on the type of problem that you're looking at, there could be good evolutionary reasons for that, to try and we have a whole set of mental shortcuts or heuristics that kind of give us quick answers to immediate problems, but I think there is diversity there too. Whereas there are some people who seem more inclined to be okay with uncertainty, or to have that habit of mind where they are engaging in reflective cognition that lends itself more to inhabiting that space. So
I would say too that, agreeing with what you're saying, Myron, that scientists, when it comes to scientific questions, are quite happy with the uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And they're excited about that because they want to push into that and find out what is new and what is unknown. Good question. Oh, thank you.
So you brought so many great points regarding how the society is going right now, regarding skepticism towards science and spreading what we consider knowledge when certain people don't have knowledge in that field, just echoing stuff that they hear. But I was looking forward to a solution at the end of it. And I'm not saying that there can be a solution, because in the past, I thought, spread education. People who are in science, we should talk about science. We should talk about stuff that we know that is, to a certain degree of certainty, is correct. When we come across weird stuff like terrain theory instead of germ theory, or denial of climate change. And in some way, I came to find that sometimes it's a bit of a waste of energy and time and effort. So and you multiply this to society, to a global society, and it becomes really impossible. Is there any solution? Is it even worth it to talk about it to people? Or is it just going to be screaming into the void, considering that, one, they may not have the knowledge, the basics of knowledge to understand what you're talking about, and two, that self-righteous, self-centered image that, anti-establishment rhetoric that I'm, amazing and everyone is horrible.
I've done my research. What's the solution, Dennis?
Oh, there isn't an easy one, as we know. Early on in the COVID pandemic, I made a comment online that, as evangelicals, we've kind of sown distrust for science on the evolution front for so long that we're gonna reap what we've sown on that front when it comes to the pandemic, and I think we have, to a large degree. Can philosophy help? Yes. Can historians help? Yes. Can pastors and theologians and biblical scholars help? Yes. Can communities, faith leaders within faith communities that can message to their in-group messaging can help? But yeah, there's no quick and easy fix that I can see.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, but I think we ought not to underestimate the power of just, authentic relationships with people, and to kind of And I've had, very productive conversations with people who might have been resistant to evolution without ever really understanding what it is, and how it can fit within for example, a Christian theological kind of framework. And so, I've had conversations where people have changed their minds in ways that I think make them more receptive to science. That's slow and patient work. But I think another way to would just be to like really, like if you can if you can get exemplars within different groups to kind of change their tune, like I think that's that has a lot of cachet. So I think how to do that.
Yeah,
So yeah, we've got a Zoom question from Rudy Kraus, and so I'm going to ask him to unmute his microphone and go ahead and
Yes,
speak.
thank you very much. Does a book like this not need to also address the shadow side of the scientific enterprise, the promoting of standing over against nature? Usually this is traced back to Francis Bacon, putting nature on the rack to force her to answer our questions. And this stance, this over against stance, has created this dangerous split with all kinds of ethical and environmental consequences, which we are facing now.
Dennis will now answer for the crimes of science.
It's a good point. And I think the book is measured on that front and has those concerns in mind. Yeah, that sort of like the misappropriation of dominion type of language and how that played out ecologically is certainly something that, that's part of the history that we can learn from. And it's actually another example, another good example of where there are people that are standing up on that front and who are good exemplars and good, like Catherine Hayhoe would be a person that would come to mind, right? So someone who is from Christian convictions and concern for the environment is positively messaging a different way of thinking, one that is, based on creation care. And so, yeah. And actually, to go back to the previous question of I don't want to all be doom and gloom, I do think, for example, that I think on the evolution issue that BioLogos and other similar organizations have moved the needle on that somewhat. I think we actually are seeing some shift, for sure. So like you said, it's slow work, it's patient work, but it's also achievable, and it takes a community to do it. Good question.
I think one thing that is connected to several of the issues that are being talked about here is just the importance of science communication, and not every scientist is as articulate as Dennis is in talking to lay audiences or non-specialists. Scientists sometimes aren't the best position to actually explain to a wider audience what it is that they do and why it matters, and even how it is that they do what they do. And I think this is where people who are in the humanities but also have interests in science can come alongside and do some honorable work there too.
Absolutely.
Sure, we'll have another question from Beth Balinsky. I don't know if you can turn your camera on at all, Beth, but otherwise we'll hear you now.
Hello, thank you. I would prefer not to. My question is mostly directed towards Myron, but both of you, thank you so much. You've spoken a lot about scientific realism, but I wonder if you would speak a little bit about an alternative way of looking at science, which is instrumentalism. Why should we be scientific realists and not scientific instrumentalists? Instrumentalism, as I'm understanding it, is the idea that scientific theories are tools for solving practical problems rather than meaningful descriptions of the natural world. So make the argument for me why I should be a scientific realist and not an instrumentalist.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just my own kind of perspective as a philosopher, is that instrumentalism will leave a few things kind of unexplained that, from my point of view, scientific realism does a better job of handling certain types of data. This is a little inside baseball conversation that I'm having right now, but we'll try and make it useful for everybody. I think that one of the realist kind of core convictions is that the best explanation for the success of science is that our best and well-confirmed theories are approximately true, right? And so it's the truth or the approximate truth of the theory that explains why it's so successful. Instrumentalists are not moved by that kind of reasoning, pointing out sometimes that there's been lots of predictably successful theories that have been subsequently overturned. And the history of science is a graveyard of failed theories in that respect. And so we shouldn't then just think that successful science is best explained by its truth, because we've had lots of experience of successful science that turned out to not be true or was rejected for a variety of reasons. So maybe this whole discussion of whether science gives us an accurate description of the world is really misplaced, when really all that we care about is whether it works, whether it's instrumentally useful for solving problems. And so, I mean, there's a lot of that can get you quite far in particularly certain quarters of different practitioners of science. Particle physicists, in my experience, tend to be more instrumentalists. Chemists and biologists tend to be more realists. And there's interesting kind of data to support some of that, my own kind of anecdotal impressions there. But at the end of the day, there are still some facts that are left that seem to cry out for explanation in ways that instrumentalism can't just handle. So maybe that's all I'll say about that right now. But I appreciate the pushback, because in stuff that I've written in collaboration with scientists on scientific realism, that's kind of the instrumentalist kind of vibe is strong in some.
Hello, thank you for that. Myron, just wondering if you could connect some of the ethics of belief stuff to the position of a layperson. So I was able to look at enough of Dennis's work to kind of realize, one, I don't know what I'm talking about, and two, this looks coherent enough for me to say I was wrong to reject evolution. But I've kind of moved on from there for like stuff with the pandemic and climate change. I no longer really look at the evidence myself so much as I trust an expert consensus of a community, and try to have conversations with those people. So how does that orientation to authority relate to what you were saying about sufficient evidence? Am I working with evidence, or I don't know? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, we all rely on the testimony of experts, and the really interesting question in this regard is, I mean, who are the experts, right? And I used to think that philosophy was, as a discipline, was most subject to interlopers, where someone read half of a book somewhere and was interested in some ideas and then marketed themselves as a philosopher, right? Which would never happen in hard sciences, right? But you must just be weeping when you have, particularly in pandemic times, just the way in which everybody there is because they saw a YouTube video, they're now qualified as an epidemiologist, right? Like, it must be so. Conversation about expertise and whom do we trust and why, I think, it relates to these underlying kind of psychological propensities that we have to find people that we trust, but how to navigate that, I don't know. How do you up the game there?
Yeah, I know. It's I sometimes think it's like back when it was just about, young Earth versus old Earth. It didn't kill anybody, right? and how it kind of does on average. Right? So yeah. But I think here's something that can maybe help as people who might be invested in communicating science to broader audiences and this is, I think, extremely relevant to lay audiences, is to just, present basic contours of the scientific image and why the majority of scientists believe the things that they do. I was able to, I attend a Mennonite Brethren church in Abbotsford, Bakerview MB Church,
and was asked to speak to an adult Sunday school class a couple of months ago about the Bible and science. And the first third of the time that I was with this group of adults was just to present some, basic descriptions of, the disciplines of, and like, I am not a scientist. I've spent a lot of time working with scientists, so I come at this from a philosopher's area of expertise, but describing to people, what is physics? What is chemistry? What is biology? Like 2-sentence descriptions, totally doing violence, but just think intro level. But then, and some key kind of results of that would constitute kind of major findings in these fields. And people had no idea. Right, had no idea, and then to be able to then apply that to some tangible benefits that we have, it's like, oh, well, maybe they do know something, right? Like it's just, I think those are ways to kind of up the bar of acceptance.
I think we'll take 2 more questions. There's one waiting on Zoom, and then one in the front here. So those will be the last 2 questions. So maybe start with the Zoom one.
Hi there, I'm James Taves. I happen to know both of you there a little bit. Yeah, there. My question is there something unique about evangelicalism to confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is a human problem. We're an evangelical community here, and this is addressed. I suspect there is, but I was wondering if the 2 of you had some comment on that.
I don't know. It is a human issue for sure. And we've sort of spoken about how science might be kind of a intentional going against that grain. Yeah, evangelicals, maybe we take that baseline and we unfortunately nurture it. And I can only think of my own experience growing up. I think there are other communities that teach their young people early on that science is not trustworthy, and so they would probably have some parallels to the evangelical experience. But yeah, we tend to reinforce that narrative in certain quarters pretty strongly, and I think it has the particular effects that it does. So maybe we just exacerbate the baseline. Myron, what do you think?
I think 2 things. I think when it comes to the way in which, and I'll just speak to the North American kind of context, because historians and theologians will point out that as a global movement, evangelicalism looks quite different in different parts of the world. But I think in the North American context, the way evangelical institutions have evolved, throughout the 20th century and into the present, particularly with respect to the values that they've put forward in training pastors and leaders and the types of leaders that have been lifted up and valorized. They're utilitarians, kind of the end justifies the means, and science kind of gets in the way of telling a good story, right? To kind of and I think nuance doesn't preach well, right? It really doesn't. I mean, you want to get someone to believe something? Here's a sad psychological fact. Just repeat it. Just repeat it, 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 repeat it. Eventually, a certain number of people will just believe it. Why? Because it's just the most cognitively salient thing, because they've heard it a million times, right? So and I think that there's a kind of a pragmatic streak in evangelicalism that has just been valued apart from any kind of nuance, because it was seen to put bums in seats, right? To bring people to the altar, right? Yeah. So there's that thing. I think also too, there's been a discussion, at least for the past 15 years, in certain circles, kind of at the different margins of the evangelical community, is the term evangelical worth kind of using anymore, right? What does it even mean? Because it's culturally, it's become synonymous in America with a certain type of political kind of bent. And so if meaning is determined by how a term is used, evangelical doesn't mean what it used to, I think, 20 years ago. And so then I think there's a selection factor there with like people who are identifying. Super fascinating Pew data that came out recently showing that actually evangelicals have kind of maintained or even experienced a slight number of growth, not because of conversions, but because of people willing to identify with evangelicalism who never go to church, right? But just because they see evangelical as this political movement that they want to buy into, has nothing to do with the religiosity or attendance in church, right?
I was wondering how one of the apparent conflicts between theology and evolution is addressed. Specifically, how is it possible that humans can be unique both in their possession of a soul and in being made in the image of God, considering our common ancestry with other less special beings? And what are solutions to this apparent conflict?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that a lot of people think that an evolutionary origin and being made in the image of God might not be compatible with each other. The short answer there is that there's nothing about those two things that, necessarily conflicts with the other, if you think about them in terms of their principles. If God is using any mechanism that God chooses to use to create humans and to bring them into relationship with him, then there's nothing about the physical mechanism by which that happens that would perhaps negate God's intention and purpose to accomplish that. I sometimes quip too and say, like the narrative in Genesis is dirt to human, like, right, to dust to human, right? And that doesn't seem like a very noble sort of origin, right? But it's because God is forming and shaping and breathing. And of course, dust has its certain meanings and resonances in Scripture. Our frailty, our humanness, he remembers that we're dust. So the idea that, somehow an evolutionary process over time would somehow be like less noble than that, or could be pushed back on those grounds. The idea that if we're made in the image of God, it's because we're called into relationship, that God calls us into a relationship, that he's singles us out for a special connection that perhaps other species don't have. Although I happen to believe that every species has a connection to God that's appropriate for that species. Just like I think that God had a connection to us in our own development that was appropriate from the time I was a single cell through division, embryogenesis, and then adolescence and adulthood and middle age. Now I guess I have to say too. That God is not impeded to relate to me because of my, the state of my physical being, because I am in his image and he's filled me with his spirit. So there's that there. There are different approaches to ensoulment. It's going to go to your question about ensoulment. Different theologians who accept evolutionary biology have different takes on that. Some hold out for sort of a punctiliar kind of event, that there's, at a certain time point in our evolutionary development, that was when God gave us a soul as a species. Other theologians are more comfortable with a gradient and that there's gray there and that we can't say at a precise moment. So there's sort of that range. Myron, you want to take it from there?
And this is all addressed in the book too. And that was another example to my reading of just the great way that both you and Michael kind of deal with just a wide range of theological and philosophical and scientifically significant kind of questions. So, I think, so you did a good job in the book, and you also kind of referenced it today in the context of altruism, but just a variety of other behaviors that we seem to have, antecedents or precursors in other species. And so, did that ever mess you up, or did that ever kind of what do you think of when you see kind of our connectedness to other species, not just in terms of the level of chromosomes, at the level of behavior and social organization in that way?
Sure. There's a video that I've shown my evolutionary biology class on occasion that has an orangutan, and it's wringing out a cloth. Like it's learned how to use a cloth to wash itself, and it's just a very human-like behavior that it's wringing this cloth, and you can see it being surprised, it's like, oh, that you can see that there's a connection, that there's a similarity there, right? By the time I encountered that evidence, I had already sort of made my peace with evolution, as it were, so it wasn't jarring in that front. I think if God chose to use an evolutionary process to build these things, like you say, like religion is very natural for us. I think part of the reason why religion is very natural for us is because that was intended, right? You know, if you're coming at it from that Christian theistic perspective, it should be a very natural fit for us, right? So I'm comfortable and somewhat delighted by seeing, you know, like I'll watch crows do their thing, and I think, you know, does God have a relationship with crows that's a little different than his relationship with a starfish? Maybe, right? And it's a delight, not a worry.
All right, well, join me in thanking Dennis Venema and Myron Penner for and so watch for many more events. This is the first one, but thanks so much for coming and taking part in this.